Ben Johnson deserves plenty of praise for the coaching staff he's putting together for the Chicago Bears. But that doesn't mean we can't still have some questions about how this staff is coming together and how it will translate for the players.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. Terms and conditions apply. On the show today, I want to go through some of the latest additions to this Ben Johnson coaching staff, including former Jacksonville Jaguars offensive coordinator Press Taylor, former Kansas City Chiefs offensive coordinator Eric Bieniemy, but also still a couple of holes needing to be filled at a couple of really key positions on each side of the ball. We'll kind of go through what that could look like, what the staff looks like kind of as it all comes together with some combinations of inexperience and different kinds of experience, and whether or not there's a lesson to be learned here from how, and some of the mistakes from how Matt Eberflus assembled his coaching staff for now things we need to watch out for with Ben Johnson's coaching staff. And so hopefully we'll get to know some of these names a little bit better and get a better sense of who's going to be coaching your Chicago Bears this upcoming season. The big lingering positions to fill as I'm recording this podcast are offensive line and defensive line coach. Those are the biggest vacancies, plus linebackers coach is also vacant at the time of this recording. But up close and personal in the trenches are going to be two really significant hires for Ben Johnson. I think offensive line coach might be the next biggest hire after offensive coordinator, really, when it comes to this offense being able to live up to its full potential, right? We've talked about how Ben Johnson's Detroit Lions teams have had really consistently good offensive line play that allows Jared Goff to be in the MVP conversation. It allows Jahmyr Gibbs to have a record-setting caliber season for them in Detroit, and for David Montgomery to thrive, and for all these players, for that offense to be its best, they needed good offensive line play. And part of that is how much the Lions invested in the offensive line in Detroit, with first-round picks in Taylor Decker and Frank Ragnow and Penei Sewell, etc. Free agent contracts for guys like, they bring back Graham Glasgow and Kevin Zeitler in free agency. Like, investing in the personnel is a big part of that, but also getting quality offensive line coaching is also a really big part of that. They had a longtime offensive line coach, Hank Fraley, has been rumored about potentially jumping to different places, but he's certainly well respected in the league. I think the Lions promoted him to run game coordinator this offseason to try and keep him around and to keep him from potentially coming to the Bears or the Jets or whoever might be going after him. But good coaching plus good talent is necessary, and the Bears have a lot of work to do in the talent department, but they're going to need a good coach as well. It's felt like the last handful of seasons with Chris Morgan as Bears offensive line coach, there just hasn't been player development in a way that's noticeable, right? You haven't seen guys take a huge step forward. Tevin Jenkins was good coming out of the draft, played good throughout his Bears career. You got incrementally better, but was that good coaching or is that just a good player? You know, Braxton Jones started as a 5th-round pick as a rookie and played all right. He's gotten a little better, but hasn't making that big jump forward. Darnold Wright from year 1 to year 2, not a huge jump forward. And you can't really point to any other, linemen getting better. They've drafted some linemen, as we just talked about, but guys making progress, you just didn't really see that player development from an offensive line perspective. And so the person the Bears bring in is going to be critical to not only coach whoever they bring in this offseason, but also to help Darnell Wright get better, to help Braxton Jones. Karan Amagashi, a 3rd-round pick, is a project player. He needs coaching perhaps more than anyone on this offensive line, and the Bears need to nail this hire. Now, when we were down in the Senior Bowl, at the Senior Bowl in Mobile last week, I talked to some folks who, and I've never wanted to play the insider game here at all, but there were some folks connected to the New Orleans Saints, who are very confident that the Bears will be hiring offensive line coach Dan Rashar, who was an offensive assistant under Sean Payton for close to a decade in New Orleans, was their offensive line coach for a little while. The Bears have interviewed Dan Rashar. They've interviewed a couple other candidates. They have not, at the time I'm recording this, landed on any candidate. I cannot say with 100% certainty that that is the case, but I have heard it on good word. It's my impression that Dan Rashar believes he's going to be the Bears offensive line coach. Now, I guess, does that mean, could an interview change Ben Johnson's mind, or could another candidate interview so well that they just have to go with someone else, or could there be a snag in terms of, I don't know, salary or contract negotiations? That's very possible. But I think people close to Dan Rashar believe Dan Rashar will be the Chicago Bears offensive line coach. We'll see how that plays out over the next couple of days here. So again, I'm not exclusively reporting that, but I will say he sure is the favorite in the house, and that was something that was making the rounds among personnel down in Mobile. And so if it is indeed Dan Rashar, we talked to Ross Jackson from Locked On Saints on Friday's podcast here a little bit about him after we talked about Dennis Allen and Declan Doyle, but Rashar coached a bunch of quality offensive linemen in New Orleans. You know, Teron Armstead makes the Pro Bowl under Dan Rashar. Andrews Pete makes the Pro Bowl. Max Unger, their center, makes the Pro Bowl. Larry Warford, they signed him as a free agent, but made the Pro Bowl. And then Ryan Ramczyk, their right tackle, was an all-pro offensive lineman. Like across 5 or 6 years as offensive line coach in New Orleans, Dan Rashar was coaching Pro Bowlers and all-pro players. Now, some of those guys were first-round picks. Obviously, again, it's talent versus coaching, right? Nature versus nurture in this regard. But he also was in New Orleans. He was running backs coach for a couple seasons. He was tight ends coach for a couple seasons, run game coordinator for a couple seasons. Spent the last 2 years at Tulane, the college, as their offensive line coach. Noticeably, Tulane has now hired a replacement offensive line coach before Dan Rashar has technically been named Bears offensive line coach. But I think there's sort of an understanding here that, like, Rashar was not fired by Tulane, but they replaced him because they know he's leaving for something else. And again, like, start to connect the dots here. Like, I think everyone's sort of preparing for Dan Rashar to be the Bears offensive line coach. The defensive line coach thing is much more up in the air. They hired Bill Johnson, who's going to be like a senior assistant and help out on the defensive line, but he's not going to be the actual defensive line coach. They interviewed Florida's defensive line coach, who is really, really well regarded among people in the league, in league circles. And I think he's a name to keep an eye on for the defensive line coach. But that's a group that needs to keep developing Javon Dexter. They need to have a reclamation project in Zach Pickens and try and get more value out of that third-round pick on the interior. Keep developing Austin Booker on the edge, and the Bears may need to bring in another edge rusher this offseason, should bring in another edge rusher this offseason. Like, they need to get better pass rush up front, period. Even though Dennis Allen will blitz a little bit more and be a little bit more aggressive, like, you still need better overall pass rush. And so a defensive line coach is going to be important to come in and get that group set and keep the young players churning through. You can never have too many good pass rushers. Keep drafting them, keep developing them, and have an abundance of pass rush up front is definitely what the Bears need. Linebackers coach feels a little bit still kind of like it's not unimportant, but you got Tremaine Edmonds and TJ Edwards and Jack Sanborn, and you know, sure, you want to develop Noah Sewell, but like, okay, you don't necessarily need a linebackers coach to come in and teach these Bears linebackers on how to play the linebacker position. They should be just fine there. So the first big question still lingering on Ben Johnson is who's going to fill these final roles. They've been interviewing a number of candidates. We'll see as this staff fills out that probably early this week we're going to get answers to O-line, D-line, and linebackers coach. From there, the staff will be set. And then you can look a little bit bigger picture at, like, one of the things that jumps out to me is how young and relatively, green some of this Bears staff is, particularly on offense. When we talk about surrounding Caleb Williams and this Bears offense with quality coaching, it's a young coaching staff. Young doesn't mean bad. Young doesn't mean they don't know what they're doing. But it is an interesting trend here. We'll look at what the Bears are putting around their quarterback and where some of the more experienced additions like Press Taylor and Eric Bieniemy start to fit into all this next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. As a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, and that means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do, and that's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. They got features that can help you write job descriptions and get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high-quality hires. I'm a member on LinkedIn. I bet you're on LinkedIn, and if you're not, a lot of your friends, family members, and coworkers are all part of the available pool of people who might not be looking for a job, but could be tempted by the right opportunity. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. The Bears' coaching decision this offseason has been all about Caleb Williams, right? Get Ben Johnson, get the offensive mind to pair with the young quarterback, unlock his full potential, and ride off into the sunset. But it's not just Ben Johnson, right? It's every layer of coaching that's going to be working with Caleb Williams and company. And so right away, you get some good name recognition from this Bears coaching staff that they've assembled here. And it's why Ben Johnson has deserved a lot of praise for the staff he's put together here, right? Obviously, Declan Doyle is a bit of an unknown, and we'll talk about that in a moment here, the offensive coordinator. But, you get former Ohio State quarterback JT Barrett as the quarterback's coach, who was coaching with Ben Johnson in Detroit, so there's some good continuity there. You add Eric Bieniemy as a running backs coach, who's been an offensive coordinator on multiple NFL teams, a head coaching candidate, was in college these past couple seasons. Wide receivers coach Antoine Randall L., former player, well-respected Steelers, I think he's in the Steelers Hall of Fame. And they retained tight ends coach Jim Dray from the previous regime, who also former player, et cetera, et cetera. Like, you've got names here. Press Taylor is the new passing game coordinator, who was the Jacksonville Jaguars offensive coordinator the last couple of seasons. And before that, Press Taylor was quarterbacks coach in Philadelphia under Chip Kelly, and then Doug Peterson won a Super Bowl with them. Like, he's been around winning teams. Eric Bieniemy has been on winning teams. There's a lot to like about how this Bears coaching staff has come together, and I agree with all the praise Ben Johnson has received. At the same time, we can acknowledge that this is a younger staff overall. And young doesn't mean bad. Young doesn't mean they don't know what they're doing. But it does mean we should, we can at least keep an eye on it and say, okay, like, versus a more experienced staff, there's tends to be value in guys who have been around longer and have seen a lot of different things. Now, you have to, the longer you are around, the more you have to adapt and grow with the changes in the league. And there's certainly a value to younger coaches bringing a fresh perspective as opposed to older coaches who have always done it a certain way, and that's the way we're going to do it, even if it's perhaps not the best way. Like, there's pros and cons to a young coaching staff versus an old coaching staff. But, like, you look more closely at the guys working directly with Caleb Williams. You've got, of course, head coach Ben Johnson is 38. Passing game coordinator Press Taylor is 37. Quarterbacks coach JT Barrett is 30 years old. And then offensive coordinator Declan Doyle famously is only 28 years old. For the record, I am also 28 years old. It is very weird to me that the Bears offensive coordinator is my age. Again, that doesn't mean Declan Doyle isn't going to be a great offensive coordinator. I don't think it means good or bad necessarily. It's just, is he a good coach or not? Who cares what his age is? But along with that, you also have some limited experience there. JT Barrett, your quarterback's coach, has been coaching for 3 seasons, right? I mean, he retired from playing just like 4 years ago. He was an offensive assistant and then assistant quarterbacks coach for the Detroit Lions with Ben Johnson. But it's not like you have a guy who's coming in and has worked with a bunch of great quarterbacks and has seen how the great ones prepare and do all the stuff and handle. Like, I'm not here to, this is not to slight JT Barrett. He just, he had a cup of coffee in the NFL and now has been on one coaching staff as an assistant quarterbacks coach, but he's never been a QB coach before. And that's the guy who's going to spend the most direct time with Caleb Williams and Tyson Bagent and whoever the quarterbacks are. But, like, you're putting Caleb Williams' hands in a quarterback who's, 6 years older than him? Whatever, a quarterback who's younger than a lot of the other quarterbacks still playing in the NFL. He's 15 years younger than Tom Brady. There's valid question marks there. Again, it doesn't have to be a red flag, but it can be a question of, like, we still need to see these young coaches, continue to prove themselves more. Same with Declan Doyle, right? He's 28. Now, he's been coaching in the NFL for 6 years, and that helps. He started at 22. He was a young addition to Sean Payton's staff in New Orleans, but he started as a kind of a generic offensive assistant and then worked his way up to tight ends coach with the Denver Broncos. But even that's only been a couple of seasons. He's only been an NFL position coach for, I think, 2 seasons. I'm double checking that number right now. 2023 and 2024 with the Denver Broncos. 2 years as a tight end coach. He had 3 years before that as offensive assistant, as a 25, 24-year-old, which, again, young people can be very successful and very good at what he does. Like, he's risen this high for a reason. I'm not here to say the Bears got some kid who doesn't know what he's doing. Not at all. It's just like, hey, as we're looking at this coaching staff, it kind of stands out how young a lot of these guys are. You got Ben Johnson and Press Taylor. Like, Ben Johnson is young for a 38-year-old head coach is quite young. Now, he's got his start very young in the NFL as well. He's been coaching for 14 seasons as a position coach, either in college or in the NFL. I think 13 of those in the NFL with 1 year in college before that. So he's been around the block a little bit. And that's obviously what matters most, right? It's Ben Johnson's offense. It's Ben Johnson who's going to be most directly responsible for Caleb Williams' success and failure. But some of that responsibility is based on who he's picked as the coaches to also coach Ben Johnson, or to coach Caleb Williams. I like the addition of Press Taylor in there as someone who has a little bit more experience. If, okay, your OC is a little light on experience and your quarterback's coach is a little light on experience, is there someone that's not just the head coach who has other duties, but another offensive mind who they can turn to in the room who's been around the block a little bit? Press Taylor is still not very old at 37, but at least he has more than a decade in the NFL. Started with the Eagles as a quality control coach, then assistant quarterbacks, then passing game coordinator, then goes to the Jaguars with Doug Peterson to be offensive coordinator there for 3 seasons, and now he's the Bears passing game coordinator. So at least he's got some different experience, some different quarterbacks, some success with Philadelphia, some failures in Jacksonville, and has seen a little bit more so that if Declan Doyle or JT Barrett are experiencing something in Chicago that they just haven't had to deal with before in their limited NFL experience, there's guys besides just Ben Johnson that they can turn to and say, hey, have you been through this before? What would you do there? Like, to be able to have some of that experience is a nice way for this staff to lean on. And then, if they end up making Dan Rochar their offensive line coach, he's 64. He's been coaching since the 80s in college and certainly in the NFL for a good decade plus here. So there's some good experience there. Eric Bieniemy as a running backs coach obviously has a lot of experience as well. Maybe a little less hands-on with Caleb Williams, but just coaches who have been around and coached in different roles that can be someone who this coaching staff can turn to and say, hey, how does this work? Now, the question I have here, beyond just the youth then, though, is some of these coaches in Chicago are Ben Johnson guys who he has worked with directly and have been a part of Ben Johnson's offense and know exactly how Ben Johnson likes things. Some of these guys are guys who have been recommended to Ben Johnson by people they've worked with and had mutual friends, and some of them he's never worked with at all. And this was a problem under Matt Eberflus that doesn't mean it's going to be a problem under Ben Johnson, but it's something to keep an eye on. But all the different cooks in the kitchen and all the different ideas coming to mix in this Bears offense. We'll look at what that dynamic might look like, where the concerns are, and where we should kind of keep an eye out for next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by PrizePicks. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, PrizePicks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. Here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least 2 players' stat projections, and if you're right, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. PrizePicks even has a free pick for the big game where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw 1 yard to count as a win for you. So if you pair that with one more correct pick, you're already cashing out. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of different ways you can play with the big game or any of your other favorite sports, basketball, hockey, tennis, soccer. When baseball comes around, they've got it all at PrizePicks. Download the PrizePicks app and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 after you play $5 win or lose at PrizePicks. Run your game. The Locked On Bears podcast is also brought to you by Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. Whether it's last-minute tickets to the big game or it's a concert, it's a comedy show, a sporting match, finding the right ticket at the right price can sometimes be a headache, but with Gametime, it's never been easier. I have the Gametime app on my phone, and I use it all the time. I just got tickets to see Daniel Tosh, still coming up in a couple months, but I got my tickets on Gametime because with the Gametime app, You can see your view from the seat you're going to purchase before you buy it, so you know exactly what you're going to be getting when you get into the venue. And you can also turn on all-in pricing so that you know exactly how much you're going to pay up front, and there aren't any of those added fees at the end of the checkout process that end up making your tickets cost way more than you thought they would. Ready to make your next big event even better? Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This Bears coaching staff has an impressive list of names and guys who individually on paper you say, ooh, it's nice to have him in the building, especially in, like lesser reduced roles, right? It's, you can have questions about Eric Bieniemy and we'll get into that in a little bit here, but like as a running backs coach, let's do it. Oh wow, he's kind of down a little bit from where he's been as an NFL offensive coordinator. Glad to grab him, right? Or Press Taylor, right? Okay. There were questions about the Jaguars offense as him as coordinator, but passing game coordinator, okay. Little less responsibility, and those guys can focus on more specific things and not have to manage so much. Like those guys are experienced NFL coaches. You have multiple coordinators on staff as assistants that are not coordinators here. That's a nice thing to be able to have. And obviously we'll see what offensive line coach and defensive line coach start to look like here. But one of the things that jumps out to me is a lesson that stood out from when the Bears hired Matt Eberflus. I remember feeling like when Eberflus put together that first coaching staff, right, with Alan Williams as defensive coordinator and Luke Getsy as offensive coordinator, the whole staff on offense was an interesting mix of coaches that none of them had really worked together, and more specifically, like had not worked with Matt Eberflus either. Like we don't need to go back through the whole thing, but like, okay, Luke Getsy comes over from the Green Bay Packers, never worked with Eberflus before, but seemed to be well recommended or whatever. They hired quarterbacks coach Andrew Janocko, who had been with the Minnesota Vikings, never worked with Eberflus, never worked with Getsy. So, okay, head coach, OC, quarterback coach, all coming from different backgrounds to work with the quarterback in fields. Okay, you got the wide receivers coach Tyke Tolbert, who had been with the Giants and the Broncos, and before that, offensive line coach Chris Morgan comes over from the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Falcons before that. Like the coaching staff Matt Eberflus assembled initially on offense was 7 different coaches from 7 different teams with 7 different backgrounds, none of which really crossed over with Matt Eberflus. And on the one hand, you can make the argument, well, that's a nice way to get a nice variety of opinions. So you're not getting a bunch of yes men who are just going to all, group think and do the same thing. Like you're getting different guys with different perspectives that can all sort of form a nice melting pot of offensive minds. On the other hand, you have a bunch of different guys with a bunch of different ideas about how things should be done, and you better make darn sure that everyone is aligned on here's what our offense is, here's how we do things, here's what we're calling this, here's how we're going to tell players this, and we're all in agreement. We are running my offense, Luke Getsy's offense in that case, or however Matt Eberflus wants to dictate it, right? You have to take all these different people from all these different backgrounds and bring them together. And that can be a real challenge. And I think that was part of the problem in Chicago was different messaging from different guys. And of course, they end up firing Luke Getsy. They obviously had to fire their running backs coach for non-football reasons. It's in terms of, what was it, HR violations and stuff. They end up eventually, changing out quarterbacks coaches. When Waldron comes in, they kind of bring in half of a new staff. But then even when Waldron comes in, another lesson from Matt Eberflus, you get a coaching staff of like half Shane Waldron guys and half Luke Getsy, Matt Eberflus guys. Because you brought in, new OC, new quarterbacks coach, new wide receivers coach, new running backs coach, but you kept your tight ends coach and your offensive line coach and a couple of other assistants on there. So like you had some guys who did it the old way, and then some new guys who were all Shane Waldron's boys. Thomas Brown as well was part of that tree, and there can again be some tension and a clash there between how are we doing things? Are we doing things Waldron's way? Are we doing things the way we always did it? And there has to be good leadership, good communication, and effective coaching there, like coaching the coaches a little bit. And it didn't feel like that was necessarily the case either. And I think that's part of why you saw the Bears struggle to have an offensive identity, because you had a bunch of different identities all trying to mix together here. And so that's going to be a really big emphasis point and, dare I say, challenge for Ben Johnson. This obviously has to be Ben Johnson's offense run Ben Johnson's way. But when you go through this Bears coaching staff, you've got some guys who worked directly with Ben Johnson before and have run the Detroit Lions offense. You've got some guys who worked with Ben Johnson's friends, and some guys who you don't really see any super clear connection, but they're otherwise, coaches that they might like. So, okay, you bring in JT Barrett from the Lions and Antoine Randall L from the Lions, and you've got two, quarterbacks coach and your wide receivers coach are Ben Johnson guys who Ben Johnson has worked for and will be instant plug and play into the system. Then you've got Declan Doyle, who worked with Sean Payton in two different stops. Sean Payton and Dan Campbell are close. The Lions offense has some similarities to what Sean Payton was doing, but never worked with Ben Johnson directly. And so at least there's strong recommendation and a lot of mutual friends there, and that makes some pretty strong, clear connections. But okay, still some question marks for me about how Doyle fits in and how well those two have just never worked together. So we don't know how well they'll work together. Certainly they'll probably make it work, but it's just one of those lingering question marks here. I'm not calling them red flags, just things that we still need to see play out and be answered. Then you get, Press Taylor, who was with the Eagles, briefly the Colts, and then the Jaguars. There's not really a clear, strong, obvious Ben Johnson connection there. I'm sure they know each other. I'm sure they've interacted a bunch. They've both been working in the NFL. I'm sure they know, it's not just a random, you're not picking him on LinkedIn Jobs because he liked his resume. I'm sure there's some real connections there, but it's not as strong as guys he's literally worked with. Or even Eric Bieniemy, right? Okay, we knew him as the Chiefs offensive coordinator and running backs coach before that. Was with the Commanders for a season as their offensive coordinator. Spent the last year at UCLA. I'm not noticing the obvious Ben Johnson connection instantly there. There's not a Sean Payton connection. There's not a Dan Campbell connection. I'm not really seeing much of that. And that doesn't make Eric Bieniemy a bad hire. He's been a great running backs coach before. He's been a good offensive coordinator at times. There are reasons why teams have not hired him as head coach. Eric Bieniemy has a reputation in the NFL that he doesn't always. I'm trying to be delicate with this. Eric Bieniemy has a reputation of maybe not everyone always gets along with Eric Bieniemy. How about that? And his style of coaching can sometimes rub people the wrong way. And that doesn't mean he's wrong and they're right necessarily. I'm not necessarily here to say who's wrong or right, but there are people in the NFL who are not big fans of Eric Bieniemy and the way Eric Bieniemy has been an offensive coordinator before, and it's a big part of why he has not gotten more serious head coaching opportunities. And as a running backs coach, all for it. Let him coach running backs. He's coached running backs effectively. I think he played running back in the NFL. I mean, he definitely was in the NFL. I don't remember for sure. I know he played a lot of special teams. Yeah, he played running back and was really good in Colorado in college. That's right. It's coming back to me now. Great. Absolutely fired up with Bieniemy coaching the running backs here. But again, Bieniemy has done things a certain way as an OC and as a Andy Reid disciple. That's going to be different from how Ben Johnson has done things. It's going to be different from how Sean Payton and Declan Doyle have done things before. And it's different than how Press Taylor and Doug Peterson have done things before, right? There has to be alignment here. We'll throw in the Bears retained tight ends coach Jim Dre, who Eberflus hired, who Luke Getsy hired, and has stuck through multiple offensive coordinators and schemes here. That usually means it's a good coach if multiple guys want to keep him around. But again, never worked with these guys before. It's another cook in the kitchen. It's another different perspective to add into this. And Ben Johnson needs to pick up where Luke Getsy failed and where Thomas Brown and Shane Waldron weren't successful in aligning coaches with different backgrounds to all be on the same page and be together. These guys some have worked for Ben Johnson, some haven't. You can't have that rift between Ben Johnson's guys and the newcomers, right? Well, JT Barrett and Antoine Randall, Ben Johnson's my guy. He's going to back me up. You guys are new here. You don't know how Ben Johnson does it. This is how Ben Johnson does it, so get in line. Sometimes you need that, and sometimes it can cause some different dynamics there. And so that's what I want to see this coaching staff come together. I want to see, clear identity of the offense. And this is how we do things, and this is how we communicate things. And all these guys instantly become Ben Johnson guys, even if they weren't Ben Johnson guys before, hadn't worked with him before, hadn't been in Detroit before. That's not a bad thing. But they need to all get on the same page very quickly. The same will be true for Dennis Allen's defensive staff. I realize we haven't really talked about that much because they still need to fill those guys. But Al Harris, who they hired as the defensive backs coach and defensive passing game coordinator, hasn't worked with Dennis Allen before. We'll see what the linebackers coach and defensive line coach backgrounds will be. But there needs to be alignment on both sides of the ball among assistants so that everyone is teaching things the same way, everyone is using the same language, and the players can have clear communication and direction on what this team is going to look like. So that's where I still have lingering questions about Ben Johnson's staff that just aren't going to be answered right away. Yeah, we'll find out who the remaining hires are going to be, but then it's a matter of how these guys mesh and meld together, and it's going to be up to Ben Johnson's leadership at the head of the organization here to make that happen. That's the idea of like, he's a good offensive coordinator. It's a new duty as a head coach that he's going to have to do that we haven't seen Ben Johnson do before, and it's one of the first real tests is to bring this coaching staff into alignment. I think there's a lot of talented coaches on the staff. I think it should come together well. We just need to see it. Certainly, if the Bears make any bombshell hires on these position coaches, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're looking for a second listen, don't forget to check out the Locked On NFL podcast. It comes out twice a day with Tyler Rowland in the morning and Tony Wiggins in the afternoon to get all of your top NFL stories covered. A lot of Super Bowl talk this week for sure to get you ready for the big game. And then we'll be around all offseason to talk free agency, NFL draft, and so much more. So really appreciate you tuning in to Locked On Bears, and I hope that in exchange, the podcast helps you get another opportunity to bear down.